Good afternoon. My name is George Parris, and I've been giving a series of lectures here which summarize papers I've published in various media. And if you really want to see the details, go look at those papers. But I'm trying to give you an easy-to-digest summary, and also in an informal format, which allows me to go into places where I would not normally go in a written document. All right. Today's title of today's presentation overall, which I hope will run about 50 minutes, 55, 60 minutes, something like that, is Last Man Standing, which is kind of interesting phenomenon. However, before I go into that, I need to sort of detail or go over two things that would maybe hook this all together. First off, the previous presentation I made was called Hopeful Monster Finds a Mate and Forms a New Species. All right. What I'd like to do first is to go back and hit the high points of that presentation, the parts that I think will help explain what's going on in this presentation, for those of you who missed the previous presentation. And then I'm going to go into something which would be like a lightning rod in a typical science class, something which I avoid like the plague. And when I give science lectures to students, I'm a chemist, I taught chemistry. People actually trust me to teach chemistry. They wouldn't trust me to teach biology. But the topics I totally avoid are sex, politics, and religion. And I don't tell jokes because there's always a butt of a joke, and you're always making fun of somebody. Okay, if you're telling jokes, you're making fun of somebody. So, and the best you can do is hope you make fun of yourself and don't offend anybody. So I avoid that crazy in the when I actually give lectures to students. But in this media, I think I'm going to try it. And then the last part of this will actually be the part about the last man standing. What am I talking about when I talk about the last man standing? All right. With no more introduction to that, I have to refer to my notes to make sure I'm on track. So pardon me when I look down, but let's summarize the high points of what I call Hopeful Monster, okay? There's four main points that I made in that video. One has to do with speciation, or they all have to do with speciation, but the first thing about speciation is how do you define a species? And Ernst Mayr had it right, and Charles Darwin had it wrong. Basically, if you have a group of organisms that can produce offspring, and if those offspring are viable and fertile and can produce more offspring, you have that group constitutes a species. If you cannot do those things, then you're not in the same species. Let me give you an example. What's the difference between viable and fertile? Okay, you can take a horse and a donkey, breed them together, and produce either what's called a mule or a hinny. Now the mule and the hinny are viable. They are working animals. They live normal lives. The whole thing works out. People have made mules for years and years and years because they are useful in that environment. But neither of those can produce offspring, and so they're not fertile. Okay, so when you have a situation there where a mule is not a species because it cannot produce offspring. All right. Now, if you take the next step, the point of that, of course, is morphology has basically nothing to do with it. It doesn't matter what these organisms look like. They can be identical in physical morphology, or they can be completely quite different in structure. This flies in the face of what the monster was supposed to look like. This guy Goldschmidt was made fun of for years and years and years because of everybody's focused on what the organisms look like. Not important at all. Now, how do we achieve this reproductive isolation that a species has? without having some weird morphology. Well, it turns out it's actually very simple. It happens all the time. There are types of mutations, in particular paracentromeric inversions and other inversions and massive fusions of chromosomes that will create a situation where you are not able to reproduce with your other people that you would normally consider your species. You may look, the interesting part about these mutations is you're viable and you look just like or very similar to everybody else. Minor issues, either in terms of mental capacity or physical capacity. It might be slightly different, not necessarily worse, okay? But otherwise, you look just like you blend in with everybody else. Nonetheless, you're reproductively isolated, because when you have these paracentromeric inversions and some other inversions which don't change morphology or viability, things happen apparently during the mitosis phase where the chromosomes don't get separated properly, okay? And so these, you can have intercourse, you can have fertilization, but it doesn't go anywhere, okay? You don't ever get offspring. Or if you get offspring, they're usually a little different, subpar physically, etc., and often just die out that way. But these mutations, these inversions, are actually quite common. It is estimated about 1 to 2%. I think I've seen 1.6% in some studies. Of all the people in the world, there's about 10 billion people, on the order of 10 billion people in the world, have mutations like this. Now, I don't know if you have to be exactly the same mutation, or if you could have slightly different mutations that are, not the same inversion sections, but close, might work. I don't know. So in any event, there's a high possibility that you could find someone, like 1 in 100 type possibility, that has a similar mutation. Maybe if this person is descended from the same grandparents, for example, or parent as you are, then you could have complete compatibility. Now, the thing that you might not appreciate is that if you have these groups that happen to have the same parity, start living together, reproducing together, you actually have a nascent new species. And I would not be a bit surprised to find that we have nascent species of humanoids running around the planet right now. This would be in societies in which familiar relationships are common, accepted, etc., or totally coincidental. So, setting aside Western sensitivity about these issues, we know, by the way, that works, that you can have people that have inversions of various sorts that can, in fact, survive. And we know that because if you look at our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, for example, and the humans, both of us have sets of inversions. All the humans have one set, and all the chimpanzees have a different set. And so, you basically, we're fertile, they're fertile, their species, we're species. But we couldn't interbreed because we don't have the right parity of these mutations. I talk about parity of the mutation because we could either have it like that or it could be inverted like that. If you're familiar with the biochemistry of DNA, you realize that the strands are, parallel, that they're opposed parallel. And so if you're like that or like that, you're inverted. So this is a fairly common thing, fairly reasonably attainable, and we know it works. Which brings us to exactly the last point here. if all you have to do is have inversions in a population to have a new species, then, you know, if you look at genetic paleontology, okay, if we look back at the genes of all the people, our ancestors, we could determine how many species we were looking at because of the presence of an inversion, okay? In all likelihood, if you looked at the number of inversions, if you take two species like humans and chimpanzees, we diverge from the same common ancestor. Every time we had an inversion or they had an inversion, they created a new species. So you could actually, if you had all the genes from all the chromosomes from all the previous ancestors, you could basically say, well, here's a species. This was not a species. It was just an evolution variety. Within each species, of course, you have the possibility of having wide variation in morphology and behavior. Darwin's finches, for example, are not separate species. They interbreed. They just happen to have evolved into separate niches in the ecology of the Galapagos Islands. So those are the main points, which is basically heresy compared to the typical Darwinian analysis of evolution. In my hypothesis about this, speciation is not the result of evolution. Evolution, changing morphology and all that sort of thing, doesn't really get you a new species. It just keeps changing. In order to get a new species, you have to have one of these breaks. And it doesn't have to be geographical. It's not a geographic isolation. It is, these species can be commingled. The only issue here is that you do progress, and the point is that speciation precedes and facilitates or allows evolution to occur. Without some sort of break here in the fertility chain, these groups are just going to keep migrating off together, you know, whatever they do. All right. So that's the summary of Hopeful Monster. All right. Now I get into a subject which is much more personal, I guess much more controversial, something I never talk about in a college class. And that has to do with primarily religion. I'm not going to really talk about sex or politics, but I avoid all of that in class. But in this, I will talk about religion. The reason being is that you're probably quite aware that when Darwin introduced the idea of evolution, what he really did, I think, was more make it a public acceptable idea. And he was very afraid of what the consequences would that be for him as a leading citizen and a upper class person and a devout religious person, Judeo-Christian type person. He worried about the outcome, about what people would think of him, what they would think of his family, how he would go down in history, all that sort of stuff. And that the background of that continues today. There's still large numbers of people. The ordinary person does not have time to study biology and talk about biological theory and evolution, all that stuff. Basically, pretty much everybody does have some sort of religious background. And as a result, the contemporary and I guess Orthodox Christian teachings basically take the Bible and say it's the Word of God and it's true. It's all true. And some people believe absolutely literally true. Other people are willing to accept part of it and say, maybe that's a little, somebody made a mistake. But in any event, the point I would make here is that evolution per se does not have any impact on Christian philosophy or Judaic philosophy or Islam philosophy. I mean, how you interact with other people, what you care about, all that stuff is not going to be impacted by how we evolve. what happens, of course, if you start thinking about evolution the way I tend to think about it, and the way most biology teachers today think about it, that cuts across the idea that the Bible is sacrosanct. You know, the Bible stops being the Word of God, it stops being perfect, it starts being discussable, debatable. And a lot of people don't want to do that, especially since Jesus, the Christian founder, people introduced a number of miracles with regard to Jesus, his birth, his death, his resurrection, all that sort of stuff, which is built into the fundamentals of Christianity. And it really doesn't have anything to do with how you're supposed to treat your neighbor. But if you start doubting one, you must doubt the other. All right. So anyway, I'm going to go tread out on thin ice and whatnot. The reason I got into this, by the way, is many of my relatives are pretty much fundamental Christians. Very nice people, very kind, gentle. I love them to death. But they don't necessarily agree with me, and I don't necessarily agree with them. And we are able to do that. I might mention that I want to wipe out one stereotype, and that's that these people who have what I call fundamental religious ideas are somehow stupid, ignorant, backwoods, all that stuff. That's not really the case, okay? I will tell you that my thesis advisor in college, my PhD advisor, a fellow by the name of Gene Ashby, who was a brilliant guy and a nice guy in many ways, he became more and more focused on religion rather than chemistry. That's sort of why we tended to part ways. But Gene, Dr. Ashby, bright guy, very well educated. He retired from Georgia Tech had some title, some very highfalutin title. He published a lot of very good papers, did a lot of very good work. But on a personal level, he was what would be called an old earth creationist, or old earth intelligent design person. The idea being that he was, as a chemist, he was well aware of carbon dating and other types of radioactive dating. So he gave up the 6,000 year guy, but he still kept the idea that it was a intelligently designed, that somehow or other God, the creator, had come in and manipulated everything so that we'd all work out. The absence of a reason for that and the statistical improbability of something randomly happening are the two arguments that most people use to support intelligent design. The fact that we don't really have a model that hooks evolution and development together. I've got one. I'll talk to you about it later. But overall, I don't think that you'll find in your college courses a good course in which they would cook development and evolution together. Now, the other point I made, and the other reason, the other argument that is very frequently brought up by intelligent design type people, is that randomly you would expect, if you tried to just have random mutations that produced the genome of the human species, or any species, the random variations are just astronomical. It takes 3 base pairs in the DNA to code for 1 amino acid. And so, it just goes crazy. Now, how do you get there? Well, this is actually a very good argument. This is a very reasonable, very rational, scientific argument. And it explains exactly why we as human beings are never going to evolve a useful gene. That is to say, a gene being a protein, a set of DNA codes that codes for a useful protein. It also explains why much of the biochemical machinery that we have in all of our cells is exactly the same as you will find in E. coli bacteria. Okay. And makes perfect sense. I use the term evolutionary power. I think that's a concept that's very useful. Basically, to calculate evolutionary power, this is a qualitative thing. It's not a rigid quantitative thing at all. But just conceptually, what evolutionary power is. If you took the number of organisms of a type, in other words, we have, what, 10 billion humans right now, something like that. And you take the time that those organisms have existed, which is, what, 500,000 years or something like that. And then you divide it by the reproductive lifespan, which is about 30 years for each generation. Do the math, and you come up with a number. That number is, for humans, is really quite small. And that even takes into consideration that the human population has exploded in the last 200 years. If you go back 200, 300, go back 1,000, 2,000 years, and you're talking about many fewer people. Okay. So we have very low evolutionary power. But, and as real, we just have to work with what we were given from our ancestors. Who are our ancestors? If you go back far enough, you get bacteria. I mean, I've looked at abiogenesis. I haven't quite bridged the gap between abiogenesis and the first organisms. I hope to do that one day. But if you go back to the point where you've got bacteria, that is to say, reproducing organisms that based on DNA and whatnot, probably have some sort of a membrane around them. Okay. Think about how many bacteria there are. I don't remember the number. It's a fabulously large number of bacteria in a drop of water. Those drops of water cover the planet. So there's a fabulously large number of bacteria. Then how long do those bacteria work? That is to say, single cell, eukaryotes, prokaryotes, etc. How long did they go along? They went along for billions of years. So you've got a very large number of organisms working for a very long period of time, and you divide that by their lifetime. And most bacteria reproduce at least once a day, sometimes every 3 or 4 hours, as I understand. I'm not a biologist, so give me a little slack there. But I don't know exactly how long typical bacteria take to reproduce. Under ideal conditions, I think it's pretty quick. So basically, you got two big numbers divided by a very small number, which makes it a bigger number. So the evolutionary power of bacteria starts looking like the type of random number you would need to build things. Now, the other key part of this issue is that in order to overcome this statistical barrier to evolution is sex. Ooh, I said it, sex. Okay, what do I mean by sex? I mean the ability to exchange DNA in this case. That's what sex basically is. We're exchanging DNA. And so once you have sex, that is to say, in the case of bacteria, we're talking about cell fusion and fission. Once you have the ability to do that, then you can have a good mutations. One of those, all you have to have is one bacteria out of all those trillions and trillions and gazillions of bacteria that are out there. One of them gets a mutation that works, and it gets passed very quickly to everybody else because that one has a substantial ecological advantage over everybody else. And it becomes the dominant strains. It just keeps going and going and going. Okay? And so I believe that the statistical argument against evolution is not really valid. I think we can overcome that if you look at the evolutionary power of different organisms the way I just did. By the same token, we're not naturally going to evolve another protein. We just don't have enough evolutionary power to do that. Okay. However, I will mention that with the technology we have now developed, stand by, within a few years, we will be creating a code and generating a protein, and we may even know what it's going to do. But we could, I think, more likely are going to be fixing proteins for a while, and it will be a while before we decide we need another protein to do something. We'll also be borrowing proteins from other species where we think they're useful, and things like that. Okay, so that sort of covers that part of the religious talk. The point being is that I don't see barriers to the idea of this. The concept of intelligent design really is a matter of how you look at the universe. If you don't have any in-between stuff, if you don't understand chemistry, biology, whatever, you can say God created the universe and it was perfect and it worked. That's sort of intelligent design. On the other hand, if you're a scientist and you saw some of the stuff in between, you're inclined to believe, well, this is the mechanism through which God works. It was not God did not sit down one day and say, I think I'll make that blood vessel a little bit bigger and put it over there. No. God created, and I prefer the term the creator, because I don't know what the creator is. Now, how do I get to this point? Okay, this is where it becomes very personal, and this is sort of my own philosophy, and you can love it or you can lump it. I don't care. Just don't ask me to change to something else. The idea comes to me this way. Okay, when people ask me, do I believe in God? I say, no, I know he exists, or know it exists. Know that there is a creator. I prefer the term creator. Get out of the gender-specific stuff and get out to something more general. So I believe that, yes, there's a creator. I think there is a overarching man. Why? Well, I'm also a scientist. Why am I thinking that way? Well, science is very good at answering questions like who, what, when, where, and how. But science doesn't answer the big why. If you ask a child, or a fairly, like a 6th or 7th grader, why does a planet revolve around the sun? They will probably say, because of gravity. Okay, fine, that's good. But then you ask the question, why is there gravity? Why is there any matter? Why is there any energy? Why do natural laws work? Science really doesn't answer those questions. We can use science to study the creation, but we cannot use science to study the creator. Does that make any sense to you? People have said things like, well, we can sit down and with our knowledge of physics and whatnot, we can project where the universe came from. We can extrapolate backwards to the Big Bang. I believe in that. They can say we can start extrapolating forward, and based on some parameters we're not sure about, the universe may continue expanding forever, or the universe may expand through some multidimensional space and come back to where it was to start with, or the universe may simply be reciprocating. It may go out, turn around, come back, like a ball going out, come back. Okay. Depending, literally depending upon the amount of mass and gravity and all that sort of thing. I don't, that's a science question. And scientists sometimes, I've heard people say, well, we could actually project back before the Big Bang. What happened before the Big Bang? Okay. And that's fine too. We probably can eventually do some of that work. But the question is, why was there a Big Bang in the first place? I think if I were on another planet, and if I were not hooked to this planet and whatnot, I'd probably, you might call this like the creator's thunderbolt. It like happened, boom. And I think everybody probably who's had some science training on whatever planet you happen to be on are converging back to that idea that there was this thing and we have this universe which we can observe, but nobody knows why we ever had that. Nobody knows why the natural laws work the way they do. why is why do energy and matter convert, all that kind of stuff. So the question of why the natural law exists and why it works the way it works is beyond our understanding, in my opinion. It's the big why. Why does anything exist? I know it exists. I can see it. I can touch it. I can measure it. But I cannot tell you why it's there. Science allows me to study the physical creation, but I can't study the creator. All right. Now, as a scientist, I have certain obligations, by the way. I see, you know, if in ecclesiastical terms, I'm not sure what that word means, but in terms of religion, I sort of see myself as a priest. Okay, I get the white robe. I don't wear it, whatever. But the my job is to study the creation and witness about the creation to my peers, my fellows, my other people. In other words, I go out and I find some fact and I publish it. I write a book, I write a paper, I do a YouTube video, whatever it takes, to tell people what I believe. The only big sin that you can make, in my view, in this path down the rabbit hole, is to falsify your findings. Faking data, intentionally bogusing data, which would mislead other people intentionally, is a bad sin. I mean, it's the sin of science. And there are a lot of people out there who do it for money, for gain, for profit, for whatever. Okay. A lot of people that doesn't mean scientists don't make honest mistakes. Scientists make honest mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes is we start calling things laws. There's no such thing as a natural law. We have hypotheses that seem to hold up real well under a lot of circumstances, but we don't create natural law and we don't define natural law in its ultimate status. What we do is, yeah, you can add a few more decimal points to pi, and you can add, you know, the speed of light is not exactly 3.0 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, but you can, you know, you can continue to refine these numbers, and occasionally you're going to find situations where a whole new technology, a whole new concept has to be introduced. This is exactly what happened with Planck. Could not explain black-body radiation with conventional physics. Had to introduce a new idea. Einstein picked up on that, and away we went. You know, you cannot explain the structure of an atom with classical physics. You can with quantum mechanics, and no doubt there's other possibilities out there. So we do make mistakes, and ideally science will converge to a good solution. And I don't think we should ever be so arrogant as to believe we know the absolute truth. Everything is a hypothesis. Bernard Shaw, I was a child of the 60s. We did a lot of Bernard Shaw in college. One of the things he said was something to the effect of, I'm not quoting exactly here, what was it? Never resist temptation. Test all things and hold fast to those that are true. Okay, so there's no such thing as a fact. We only have hypotheses that stand up real well. So that's sort of where I am in religion, and I think that's sort of where science should be in religion. So having dealt with that one, now let me go ahead and start talking about last man standing. And this sort of comes about through the historical view, and this started with Darwin and Wilberforce and Huxley. Right? There was a famous debate shortly after Darwin and published his book. I mentioned the situation between Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace earlier. Darwin published this book in which he said basically was saying evolution creates species, and I challenge that. But regardless, and the reason I challenge it, or one of the reasons I think we need to think about that again, is because of the problems that it creates. I mentioned some of the issues about racism and hierarchies and all that sort of stuff in one of my last videos, and I hope you weren't offended by that. May not have been elegant in my presentation, but it was my intention to point out that we are all humans, and we just happen to evolve into different ecological niches, and we're still humans, and we can still interbreed, and we can still create, we can, if it gets colder, we're all going to look like we're designed for the cold. If it gets hotter, we're going to design for heat. In any event, there was this famous debate, Huxley versus Wilberforce. Wilberforce made some comment to the effect of basically needling Huxley, like, was your grandfather an ape or your grandmother an ape? Which side of the family did your ape come from? And Huxley said something to the effect of, I'd rather be descended from an ape than from someone as narrow-minded as you. Okay, this became very famous, and actually I think this created the idea that we descended directly from the apes, that that there was a lineage from apes to humans. And so you will find this term descended from the apes, descended from whatever, over and over again. And one of the most remarkable ideas there is that the idea that we were branch-holding, tree-swinging people before we were on the ground. And I think that's wrong. I really do. And the reason I think it's totally wrong was you go to the Congo River basin in Africa. There are chimps on both sides of the river, genetically the same type, okay? And they can interbreed, and they can all do it. They're all one species. On the south side of the river, you have, I think it's bonobos, and on the north side you have what's called chimps. And the difference is quite remarkable in the way they behave. The bonobos are peaceful, hippie-type guys, gals, they sort of free love type folks. The chimps are much more aggressive, mean type animals. I've read papers where they indicate that the DNA exchange between these two groups on opposite sides of a pretty good sized river, but it's a slow river. Opposite sides of this river have not really interacted in thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. I'm not sure what the numbers would put. There's very little gene exchange between these two groups within the same species. And the only thing that divides them is a river. A slow-moving river with lots of stuff. I'm looking at that and I'm saying, well, it turns out chimps don't like to swim. Chimpanzees, bonobos are not swimmers. They don't swim. And they don't walk on water, and they don't swing across the river on vines or anything like that, apparently, either. Nonetheless, we have an ancestor of us called orangutans over in Indonesia, which is a ways away. Now, how the hell did we get ancestors in Indonesia if we can't get across the river? I don't get it. Okay, so this started me thinking, obviously, and it was my opinion. It's my opinion that we had to be in order to get from Indonesia to the Congo and in and out of Africa and back and forth, which has happened many times, both as pre-humans and as humans. We must be very mobile. And to be mobile, you have to walk, pretty much. We are walking and running type species. So my idea, the last man standing idea, is that we are really, humans are closer to our ancestor than chimps and gorillas and Pongo, which is the orangutans. Let's go back. Let's talk about some of the history here. I have this little chart made up. Put things in perspective. You go back 500 million years ago. That's MYA, capital MYA, I believe is the abbreviation. Sorry for the getting very close to the screen there. But if we go back and look at this, that's 500 million years ago. Africa and South America were separated. They physically separated and were separate for a very long time, obviously. If you go back to about 370 million years ago, that's when plants developed seeds and started spreading throughout the landmass. You know, the seeds moved, carried, etc., and just spread grass and trees and whatnot around the entire planet. Mammals date back to about 220 million years ago. And then live birth in mammals can be traced back to about 160 million years ago. Primates, our sort of direct ancestors, can be traced back to about 80 million years ago. And about 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs were wiped out, apparently by a meteor hitting the Earth. Interesting story. I'm not going to go there. It's not relevant to what we're talking about here. Much more relevant to us was that about 61 million years ago, we lost the Glo gene, G-L-O gene. And I don't recall something, I forgot the name of the gene. It has to do with conversion of essentially glucose to ascorbic acid. Why is that relevant? Why do we care? Well, first off, it's a long biochemical process. It's a number of steps involved, and every step has a protein which is coded for in a gene. And when you have a chain like this, if you break the chain, you may accumulate a intermediate which might be toxic or might otherwise have adverse effects. It turns out the very last protein that does the last conversion here is the GLO protein, which is tied to the GLO gene. And if you lose that, it turns out that nothing really bad happens, but you don't make ascorbic acid, which we know as vitamin C. The reason that's important, and important in terms of our evolution and our history, is that without ascorbic acid, if you don't have any ascorbic acid in your diet, you're good for about 60 to 90 days. After that, you're in trouble. You get a disease called scurvy, and there's some other things that happen. Scurvy is classically involves bleeding gums, loss of teeth, stuff like that, general deterioration of your connective tissue, and it's lethal. And so the point is here that in order for the species to survive, we had to be where there was a good supply of fruits and vegetables, which provided vitamin C. If you don't have a GLO gene, you better be close to some vegetables, some other types of fruits and vegetables that you can eat. This was never sort of became apparent to people until we started having long sailing voyages in these 14, 15, 16, 1700s, where we'd get on a boat and we would go sailing around the world for a year. Well, the problem with scurvy was very big, and people worked very hard to figure out how to avoid it, and that's the British Navy started carrying lime juice and limes and stuff like that, because that was about the only thing that they could carry and maintain. And even in World War II, my father called British limeys. It was a name that stuck. So anyway, so if you're going to survive, you had to have a steady supply of these things. You could potentially traverse all sorts of terrain, but you still had to have this input. You couldn't go out and live in the middle of the desert forever. You couldn't go out and raft around the world forever, but you could, if you had a supply of vitamin C, you could go where the vitamin C was. Now, if we go to the next step, all right, about 40 million years ago, there were monkeys, and the monkeys obviously survived or multiplied and did very well because they went up into the tops of the trees. They were very, very easily able to climb trees and whatnot and get fruit, and they were above the level where the flies and the mosquitoes were, so they're not as likely to be attacked by malaria, sleeping sickness, and other diseases like that. So they're up in the top of the trees. They get fruit. They go from treetop to treetop. They live up there. They have a great time. And apparently, about 35 million years ago, looking at this right here, they managed to, when you have big rivers and lush vegetation, you can actually get rafts of plants and trees and dirt and whatnot all mixed together, and occasionally it goes drifting off across the ocean. And apparently about 35 million years ago, the monkeys succeeded in drifting all the way from Africa to South America. And so the monkeys ended up with old world monkeys and new world monkeys, because some of the old world monkeys drifted to the new world and created a whole new group of people over there, group of animals over there, evolving. I'm not sure if they're different species. I haven't ever looked into that. Interesting. They probably are separate species by now. So anyway, if we go further down the line here, if I can get this lined up, about 20 million years ago, the apes, the monkeys were in, the apes ended up with Pongo. That's the orangutans. And then about 12 million years ago, we ended up with gorilla. That's the gorillas, obviously. And then about 8 million years ago, we ended up with the chimpanzees, Pan. And we're down here with modern humans, a Homo, over here someplace, wherever that is. I'm doing this backwards, but anyway, there it is. So the point I'm making here is that at the time that Pongo got to where Pongo is, assuming that we all arose in Africa, somehow or other we were going to Indonesia from Africa. And the only way to do that's on foot. We didn't have motorcycles, we didn't have boats, you can't raft there easily. So in my view, the ancestors of humans and Pongo and chimps and whatnot were in fact free-ranging, free-moving plains apes. Now, how do I account then for gorilla and chimpanzees? Well, if you look at the Congo basin again, I believe that the plains apes were runners and walkers, and they were following the herds of animals that they could live off of, as well as a certain amount of probably just scavenging food behind the lions and tigers and things. But this was a marginal existence, and if you had a speciation event, one of those species might find it convenient to go into the tropical woods, the Congo basin. And in the Congo basin, in order to survive against the tsetse flies and the mosquitoes and malaria and sleeping sickness and all the other stuff, you want to go up in the trees and get that same fruit that the monkeys are getting. And you also want to sleep above, high enough in the trees to get away from the mosquitoes that are down running around the swamp. And so I believe, my view, is that not that humans evolved from chimps, but rather that chimps evolved from humans. Or put it a more reasonable way, is that the common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees and with gorilla and with Pongo all were more like us than like them. Certainly in the case of chimpanzees and gorilla. Humans are the last man standing. The others became left the plains and went into the forest, climbed the trees, and have a habitat which involves sometimes in the trees and sometimes on the ground. Humans do not do well in the Congo. If you look at the genetic migration maps, what you find is that 100,000 years ago we were in Australia. Okay, that out of Africa all the way to Australia, 100,000 years ago. But if you look from East Africa, which is sort of regarded as a cradle of human civilization, into the Congo basin, it's more like a 50,000 year difference. Like, why? Why is it taking so long to get there? Why it took 50,000 years to establish a population in the Congo basin. In 100,000 years, we went all the way to Australia. And obviously, we've had other species of ape-like critters all over Eurasia in the Middle East. I think what's happening is that humans, modern humans, and a lot of our recent ancestors were simply not adapted to the environment in the Congo basin. We're dying off from malaria and sleeping sickness primarily. Even today, even in modern times, the death rate among pre-pubescent Africans, that would be Congo basin type Africans, is about 30%. If 30% of the population that is born dies before puberty, there's going to be an enormous pressure to anything that will keep you alive through puberty is going to show up in this population. And those mutations, for the most part, are mutations which counteract malaria. And they, even though they actually cause problems in adults, if you don't make it to puberty, you're just not going to transfer your genes. And so if you make it to, even if the mutation is very adverse, as for example sickle cell anemia is, if you don't make it to adulthood without it, it's not going to show up. In other words, it's going to be rewarded because it gets you to puberty, even though it causes problems down the road. And so I believe basically what you're seeing is in the African population is preyed upon by mosquitoes and tsetse flies, which wipe out people. I'm not sure that humans would survive if you put a big fence around the Congo basin. I'm thinking that if there were no immigration, no recent immigration from East Africa, that eventually humans would go extinct in that area. So philosophically, I have two ideas here. You can either drain the swamp, that is to say, you can break down the barrier that keeps the Congo River from running quickly to the Atlantic Ocean. Basically, that would be physically, technologically easy to do. Break down that mountain range that keeps the Congo River dams up above it. There's something called the Lake Kinshasa, used to be called Stanley Pool. It's a big lake. that the Congo River flows into, and then it trickles over the spillway and falls a long way down to the ocean, Atlantic Ocean. There's no ocean traffic up the Congo. The Belgians back in the late 1800s, if you watch the movie or read the book Heart of Darkness, the Belgians are building a railroad to get from the Atlantic Ocean up to what is now Kinshasa, and from there on up. So it was Leopoldville at that time. In any event, you could cut that down, drain the lake, and just make the rivers flow faster. The problem with that is not only would you eliminate a lot of the mosquitoes, you would also change the ecology of the situation, that we would lose a lot of other species that are up there, and people wouldn't want to do that. The other possibility is you can basically ask the people there to move out and establish an international park, the Congo International Park, where you could go and look at the animals and, mine some minerals and whatnot, but you couldn't try to inhabit the area and build big cities and whatnot. I think those are the two logical alternatives, and I don't know who would want to do which. In either case, there's tremendous hydroelectric power to be had between Kinshasa and the mouth of the Congo River on the Atlantic, and that could be captured, whether you speed that flow up or not. You could capture that water down below, and you can generate a tremendous amount of hydroelectricity. You could light up all of Africa and most of Europe with it. And sooner or later, somebody's going to do it. There are some big projects already up there, but nobody has invested with the idea of we're going to electrify the continent, and we're going to put the billions of dollars, many billions of dollars, probably several trillions of dollars probably, to do that. That's essentially my talk today. That's why I called it Last Man Standing. I believe that humans, modern humans, are indeed more like our common ancestor with the chimps than the chimps are. I believe the chimps and the gorilla have adapted to living in the Congo basin. We have not, because of a constant influx from outside. The gene pool in the Congo basin has survived marginally. That is to say, the modern human gene pool has survived marginally. And this is a place, by the way, where eventually you might see a whole new species of humanoids evolve. But I don't think it's happened yet. Obviously, the Africans that are in the Congo basin today are fully human. We interbreed with them very readily. I don't really have anything else to add to that. I've been going about an hour, which is about right what I wanted to do. And hope you haven't found this to be too radical, either from a religious standpoint or from a scientific standpoint. I'm not quite sure where I'll go the next talk. I might step back and talk about abiogenesis, or I might start laying the groundwork for what I call my Evo Devo paper. Do I have that? No. Yes. When I started doing this, excuse me for stepping off the camera. When I started doing this, I'd given away all my copies of this book. But in this book, I talk about some of these topics, that how can we couple evolution and development, and what it takes to do that. Actually, where I probably will go is talk about differentiation of cells, because that underlies this. I'm very surprised that we have such poor understanding of how cells differentiate. Okay, well, thank you for your time, and I hope I haven't upset anybody. You can always leave comments below. This is just my outlet for this material, which is, like I said, I've already put it in books and it's out there. You can find it on Amazon.com. Have a great day. Thank you.